I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. Today I'm speaking with Professor Tom Feddesen. He is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. Hello, Professor. Thank you for joining us on UATV.
Hello, Alex. Glad to be here.
In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. What does that mean in the global order? How much of a risk is this to the international security?
Well, I'd consider it a fairly significant risk, and please do understand these are my personal opinions, not those of the U.S. Naval War College. But the reason that I considered it significant is because this is such a clear violation of international norms and international laws. The simple fact that a recognized part of Ukrainian territory was annexed, and I will say forcibly, by Russian inspiration, if not Russian forces, is a very material event.
Was the fault, obviously it was Russia who annexed Crimea, but was this a major blunder on the side of the West allowing this to happen?
Well, there are times that you can have actual blunders, and other times they might be called sins of omission. The question is, was the West in position to do anything forcibly to stop? And in this case, I fear that there simply was not the military or political might to stop this Russian incursion.
So President Obama, the EU, NATO, there was very little they could do politically and militarily.
Yes, I'd go along with that. Certainly, there was dislike, and in fact, more than that, very strenuous objection to this annexation based on the sanctions, which eventually got applied. But clearly, you'll note that there was no military activity on the part of the West.
Does Russia annexing Crimea, does this almost signal an end to the post-Cold War era? It was marked by idealism, and we had the war in the Balkans. The international community came together to solve that situation. We had post-September 11th, we had non-state actors, but now are we back to the traditional realpolitik, big nation versus big nation, fighting for territory?
Well, perhaps. Let's put ourselves in Russia's shoes, though, for a second, and recognize that while the West was doing what it did, and we certainly felt that we were doing all these things correctly in support of the local people, in support of democracy and human rights, Russia was silently suffering over the fact that the West was moving closer to Moscow. Perhaps had they articulated it a little more clearly, it would have been better for everyone, but it was almost like they suffered until they effectively claimed that they exploded. And so have relations changed? Indeed they have, and not in a good way either. There's, in no uncertain terms, if you read the documents that either side is putting forward, and I teach this at the Naval War College, I look closely at the strategies that the various sides put forth. The term enemy and aggressor was simply not to be found in any document on either side. Now, starting in 2014, both NATO and the United States and Russia are no longer afraid to tell you exactly who they think that the aggressor is. So this is clearly a new tone in geopolitics.
What was wrong with the West getting closer to Russia during the 90s? We had Yeltsin, Clinton. What was wrong with that? I mean, how did we not see that this was a major issue for people in the Kremlin?
Well, to some extent, they denied that it was a major issue formally. It was only informally, and now after the fact, that they're telling us that why didn't we see the signal? Didn't they know what we were doing? I'm perfectly happy to blame them to a great extent. I was there in Brussels for a lot of these discussions in which it wasn't at all clear to me that they were so badly offended by NATO's activities. But every now and then there was a small explosion, for example, Kosovo. But mostly we felt that we were doing the right thing and that Russia was cooperating with us. In fact, cooperate was the verb that we used most often. So perhaps we shouldn't have been so surprised, but we were.
Essentially, they didn't want to become so close to the West.
Yes, they sent us every signal for a long time that they emulated the West, that they wanted to be Western. But there's a certain schizophrenia about Russia. They look east, they look west. You're never exactly sure where they're going. It's clearer now with Mr. Putin in charge, the direction that they're going in. It is certainly not to become another member of the West.
Do you think going forward, do you think nationalism is underestimated? I know you've written that Putin is playing off of nationalism, not logic. Do you think a lot of times we forget how powerful nationalism can be amongst nations and people?
Well, there's no doubt about that. I mean, for a number of years, there was this sense that the world was outgrowing nationalism. But just look around the world today. Look at almost any country you choose. My own, certainly, Western Europe. Let's look at the Netherlands, Germany. How about Brexit in the United Kingdom? So Putin is playing the same card that many Western politicians are playing. Nationalism, of course, can be a unifying force, and it has been a unifying force throughout much of the 20th century. But now, can it begin to disunify things like the EU, things like the Western Alliance? And I would say yes, possibly. But more certainly, it is one of those forces that can bring Russia together and give Putin popularity numbers that are unimaginable in the West. Perhaps some of it is contrived, but I think a lot of it actually is real.
How can we prevent, something like what happened with Crimea from happening in the future? We apply sanctions, but the force of nationalism is greater than, any sanction, perhaps. So what is the way to combat this?
Well, that's true, but Crimea was to some extent a unique situation. Not just the nationalism card, nationalism to a very high and intense level, but also remember Russia had perhaps its largest naval base on Ukrainian soil, and Russia's interest in Crimea was bigger, I think, than Russia has almost anywhere else. But not, and it was partly, but it was also partly the fact that she had such a strong military force there, needed Sevastopol as well as the other military bases that she had there for what she perceived as her own national self-defense. So I'm not sure we will see similar situations anywhere else in the world of that intensity, but certainly nationalism was a big part.
Are you concerned about some of the risk we see in China, the South China Sea, Russia and Crimea, and even in the Balkans, Serbia? There's in Kosovo. There's not hostilities, but there is some tension there that's resurrecting itself.
No, absolutely. I would say that all the optimism that I had when I was serving in a policy position for the U.S. government in the 1990s has certainly been quieted to some extent by the various forces out there. China and the South China Sea, there's no doubt that the United States and China do not see eye to eye in the way we view the South China Sea. But any number of these nationalist forces, and it's more than nationalism too. It's power politics that are beginning to come to play much more than they did 20 years ago. So, indeed, I think there's much more danger in the world internationally. We had pushed it aside for some number of years, but we really do have to confront it today.
Do you think NATO will continue to serve the purpose that it has, continue to act as a counterbalance to Russia?
That's up to Vladimir Putin. And I say that because I served in NATO when there was a clear Soviet threat, and there was little difficulty getting the alliance on one page back then. As the Soviet Union fell apart and Russia for a long time was essentially dormant, that's when NATO began to see the world differently. In fact, NATO went beyond its borders to a great extent successfully in the Middle East. But more importantly, NATO is not obsessed and concerned with Russia the way it used to be, save the country on Russian borders. Now, the more Putin pushes, the more NATO will push back. The difficulty that I see right now is that I think Putin, while a risk taker, is not stupid. And he has been perfecting what people will call hybrid warfare or gray area warfare, such that he can do things without stepping over the line. And my fear is that he will successfully continue to push without stepping over the line, ergo uniting the alliance.
Do you think right now we're in the midst of a hegemonic shift? We're seeing the rise of China, even Russia, almost a pulling back of the United States and of Europe. Or even not even a unified Europe anymore? Do you see this hegemonic shift happening?
Well, yeah, I see it going in that direction, but I'm going to step back from that a little bit and say, let's give it a few more years to play out. For example, Russia, yeah, she's like a boxer throwing a couple of sparring punches. Does she have the economic wherewithal to sustain this? Maybe not. China, more likely to have the economic might to sustain a little bit of assertive behavior, but she has so much to lose economically. So I'm not going to be that much of a pessimist, but I certainly am more pessimistic today than I might have been 10 or 15 years ago. I say let's give this a little time to play out.
What is your greatest fear, your greatest worry right now on the geopolitical stage?
Well, I think my greatest political worry, and I don't normally say this about leaders, but I have yet to, I've been studying Putin for some time. I've yet to say that I think I've got him figured out, and I don't think anyone has him figured out. I take the position that he's a risk taker, but that he overplays his hands. And if he misinterprets the power of his hand, overplaying it can be a genuine disaster for the entire world. So I'll point the finger in that direction. I'm not sure that anybody knows where he's going. I'm not sure he knows where he's going. He's also an opportunist. Yeah, I don't see the move in Crimea as a grand Russian imperial plan. I see it as opportunism. But once the opportunity presented itself, he went in with both feet.
What would be an example of him overplaying his hand?
He might look at the Baltics, for example, and see more pro-Russian sentiment than there actually is, and pushing too many of his military forces too close to places like Estonia, which eventually might solidify not just the Balts, but perhaps even all of NATO.
We had a guest on last week, or I think it was a week before, who said that in any excursion, that Putin does in Latvia, if he goes into a small town, does something minor, and we don't do anything in return, that is just a complete collapse of NATO. Would you agree?
No, I think that's an overstatement. I think there's a lot of gray area before we start crossing Article 5. But that's up to NATO. In essence, NATO can choose to collapse. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. But I do fear that the smaller the push that Putin makes, the smarter it will be. And it will be, NATO is certainly very good at talking about situations like this. My hope is that even a few small pushes will get NATO to do more than talk. But a couple of what we might call hybrid warfare excursions or gray area excursions. We've endured some of that already. We're still alive, but we do have a breaking point.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Feddesen. Really appreciate it coming on.
Thank you very much, Alex. Happy to be here.
Thank you. I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. That was Professor Tom Feddesen. He is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. Thank you.